Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
They bought my brother a Tesla for his birthday. I got a casserole dish for mine. Not a joke, not an exaggeration, not a metaphor dressed up in bitterness, just the plain, stupid truth. A ceramic casserole dish with little blue flowers etched along the edge, the kind you see in discount kitchen stores stacked under fluorescent lights, the kind that says, "We remembered you, eventually." And meanwhile, Evan stood in our parents' driveway, grinning like a goddamn movie star while everyone clapped and cheered and took pictures of him leaning against a sleek, black Tesla Model S, a gift that cost more than I made in a year. I remember standing there with my paper plate of dry pasta salad, watching my mother snap photo after photo of Evan next to his new car like he was some kind of celebrity they'd just discovered. My father was beaming, really beaming, the way he used to when Evan won Little League trophies or got into college on that scholarship they never quite admitted was helped along by a favor from a friend. I stood off to the side, trying to be invisible without actually disappearing, holding my glass of cheap wine and nodding politely at the guests who remembered just barely enough of me to offer a "how's work going?" before turning back to the main attraction. That party wasn't for Evan's birthday, it was a celebration of favoritism, a shrine to the golden child who could do no wrong, even when he did everything wrong. And the worst part wasn't the Tesla or the way they fussed over him like he'd just cured cancer. The worst part was that I wasn't even surprised. It was just another chapter in a book I'd been reading since I was 12, a story where my name was always in the margins, scribbled in small letters, easy to skip over. They called him brilliant, even when he failed classes. They called him spirited, even when he screamed at my mother in front of guests. They called him misunderstood, even when he cheated on his ex-girlfriend and lied about it for months. But me? I was practical. I was level-headed. I was the one we don't have to worry about, which really meant I was the one they didn't have to notice. I left that party early, muttering some excuse about a work deadline I didn't actually have. I didn't want to see Evan open his other gifts. I didn't want to hear my dad's voice go soft and proud when he talked about how Evan deserved something nice for once. I didn't want to pretend I was happy just to keep the peace. Because I wasn't. I wasn't happy, and I hadn't been for a long damn time. I got in my car, my old dented Honda with the cracked dashboard and the broken radio, and drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. Later that night, just after midnight, my phone buzzed. I almost didn't answer, but something about the timing felt off. It was Lena, my closest friend since college, her voice sharp and breathless on the other end. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, skipping past greetings like she always did. "There's been an accident. Hit and run. Someone smashed into a streetlight on Larkspur Avenue. Guess what kind of car it was?" My stomach dropped before she even finished. "Tesla," she said. "The cops are looking for the driver. No injuries, but it's a mess. Car was totaled. Witnesses said it was a guy, maybe early 30s, looked drunk." I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there in my kitchen, staring at my unopened mail on the counter and listening to the dull hum of the refrigerator behind me. "Tell me it wasn't Evan," Lena said, but we both knew it was. I didn't need to confirm it. That kind of recklessness had his fingerprints all over it. Sure enough, the next morning, just after sunrise, I heard a knock at my door, too soft, guilty taps followed by silence. When I opened it, there they were, my parents, standing side by side like statues of shame, my mother's hands clenched in front of her, my father looking anywhere but at me. "We need to talk," she said, voice too calm to be innocent. I didn't invite them in. I didn't even move. My father cleared his throat, shifted his weight, then looked me dead in the eye and said, "It's about the accident last night. We need you to tell the police you were driving the car." I blinked. Once. Slowly. They didn't even try to lie first. Didn't try to soften it. "Just say it was you," my mother added, like she was asking me to pick up milk from the store, like this was just another small favor in a lifetime of them. And I smiled. I smiled so wide it almost hurt. because they didn't know what was coming next. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in your chest when someone asks you to destroy yourself for the sake of keeping the peace, and you've done it so many times before that your first instinct isn't anger, it's compliance. That was the silence that filled me as I stood in the doorway that morning, watching my parents squirm under the weight of their own cowardice, watching them avoid my eyes like the truth might burn them if they looked too long. I didn't answer right away. I didn't scream or slam the door or throw a coffee mug at the wall like a woman on the edge in some made-for-TV drama. I just stood there, nodding slowly, letting their words roll around in my head like broken glass. They were already in damage control mode, talking over each other, tossing out half-baked explanations like breadcrumbs. It was a one-time mistake, my mother said. He was upset about work, my father added. You know how Evan gets. They looked at me like they expected me to understand, like I'd slip right back into the same role I'd played my entire life, the quiet fixer, the dependable sister, the one who cleaned up after the golden boy without asking questions or demanding thanks. And maybe part of me did slip. Maybe the old reflex kicked in, the one that told me it was easier to say yes than to fight a war I knew I couldn't win. Because I did say yes. I nodded. I said I'd take the blame. I even told them I'd go down to the station myself if it came to that. And the relief that washed over their faces made me feel sicker than anything I'd ever felt before. They were grateful. Grateful that I was still willing to burn for their favorite child. Grateful that I hadn't made a scene. Grateful that I was still as spineless as they remembered. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to consider, was that something inside me had cracked a long time ago, and they'd just given me the perfect reason to let it split wide open. Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do, just because it was easier to sacrifice you? Easier for them to keep their golden child polished and spotless while you absorb the dirt? Easier for them to twist your silence into complicity, to call it loyalty instead of learned helplessness? If you have, then you know the kind of rot that grows under your skin over time, the kind that looks like obedience on the outside, but feels like rage bubbling just beneath the surface. I've taken the fall more times than I can count. When Evan stole money from our parents' emergency fund in college and blamed it on me, I was the one who got the lecture about trust and responsibility. When he got caught with weed in his backpack in high school, I was the one they sent to the principal's office because it would look better coming from you. When he wrecked our father's old car during spring break and swore I'd been the one driving, I was the one who lost her summer job paying off the repairs. I swallowed every lie like it was my job, smiled through every accusation like it didn't scrape the inside of my throat raw. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't going to break. I was going to bend. Bend just far enough for them to believe they still had me. Bend until they got comfortable again. And then I was going to snap so hard they'd never see it coming. I watched my parents leave that morning with the same smug satisfaction they always wore after coercing me into another sacrifice. My mother kissed my cheek like she was proud of me, like she thought I was still that little girl who used to beg for scraps of affection. And I let her believe it. I let them both believe it. Because when you're planning a slow, deliberate revenge, the most important thing is letting your enemy think they've already won. I waited until their car was out of the driveway, then walked back into the house, shut the door behind me, and leaned against it with my eyes closed, breathing in the silence not as surrender, but as preparation. Something had shifted. Something had settled into place in me that had been teetering for years. And I knew right then I wasn't going to waste this moment. I walked over to my kitchen counter, picked up my phone, and scrolled through the contacts I hadn't touched in years until I found the one I needed. A name I hadn't spoken aloud since a very different version of myself existed, a version that had teeth, that knew how to play dirty when it mattered. I pressed call and waited. When she answered, her voice was sharper than I remembered, but just as steady. "Rachel," she said. "Well, damn. I didn't think I'd hear from you again." I smiled, really smiled this time, not the kind I gave my parents, but something colder, something real. "It's time," I said. "Let's finish what we started." There's a strange kind of power in being underestimated, especially when the people doing the underestimating are the ones who've known you your whole life, but never truly bothered to see you for who you are. My parents thought I'd take the fall quietly, like I always had, Thought I'd nod and smile and tell the police whatever needed to be said to keep Evan safe and their image intact. And I did exactly that, at least on the surface. I played the role so well it almost frightened me. I wore guilt like a second skin, softened my voice, lowered my eyes, let my hands shake just enough to seem authentic. I was careful not to overplay it, just enough remorse, just enough confusion, just enough hesitation to seem like a woman who'd made a terrible mistake and now just wanted it all to go away. When Officer Delgado came to question me, I let him sit at my kitchen table, offered him coffee I knew he wouldn't drink, and gave him a version of the story that sounded shaky but plausible. I told him I'd had a rough night, that I'd been feeling distracted, that I'd clipped the curb and panicked. I kept my voice soft and stumbled over a few words on purpose, gave him a narrative laced with just enough self-blame to make him lean in and nod sympathetically. I knew the script. I'd grown up watching my mother perfect it. I'd studied every sigh, every hand-to-heart gesture, every well-timed pause designed to make people think, poor thing. But while I was performing for the cops, I was also working behind the curtain, laying the groundwork for something far less charitable. Because what my parents and Evan didn't know, what they never even thought to consider, was that I'd been preparing for this kind of betrayal for years. I'd been documenting every shady little secret they thought they'd hidden, every moment they thought I wasn't paying attention. Because even when you're treated like an afterthought, you still see everything, you just learn not to speak. I had years' worth of receipts, both literal and metaphorical. Screenshots of text messages Evan sent while blackout drunk, bragging about scams he'd pulled, credit cards he'd maxed out under fake names, accounts my parents had quietly paid off to keep him from facing consequences. I had audio clips, conversations accidentally recorded on my phone during family dinners where my father casually discussed moving money around in ways that would have made an IRS agent's head spin. I had phone logs showing late-night calls between Evan and a woman he swore he hadn't seen since college, a woman whose name later appeared in a restraining order filed quietly out of state. All of it cataloged, organized, archived. Just in case. Just in case they ever pushed me too far. And now they had. I started planting the pieces slowly. Not recklessly, no. This wasn't about chaos, it was about control. I made sure every planted seed had roots, made sure every breadcrumb could be traced to Evan without ever pointing back at me. A few anonymous emails to a journalist who owed me a favor from years ago. A flash drive slipped anonymously into Delgado's precinct mailbox with encrypted files that would raise more questions than answers. An untraceable tip sent to Evan's employer suggesting they take a closer look at his expense reports. It was surgical. It was methodical. It was vengeance dressed as coincidence. I didn't feel guilty. Not even a little. Because the truth is, this wasn't just about the Tesla or the crash or my parents asking me to lie again. This was about every time they had looked me in the eye and told me Evan just needed more understanding. About every time I'd been punished for telling the truth while he was rewarded for hiding it. This was about balance. About finally making them feel the weight of every lie they'd ever forced me to carry. But even as I set my traps with precision, I felt something dark creeping in from the edges. Not regret, never that, but something colder. A kind of detachment that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't just playing a role anymore. I was becoming it. And maybe that was the cost of finally standing up for myself after decades of silence. Maybe you have to lose parts of yourself to win. I told Lena everything a few nights later, met her at that old diner we used to escape to in college when the world felt too heavy. I laid it all out, the fake narrative, the planted evidence, the dirt I'd been collecting like a war historian. She listened quietly, barely touching her coffee, her fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the edge of the table. When I finally finished, she looked at me for a long time, her eyes unreadable. Then she said something that stuck with me harder than anything else that week. "If you push this too far, Rachel," she said quietly, "you won't come back the same." And I knew she was right. But I also knew it was already too late for that. It didn't take long for the cracks to start showing in Evan's carefully constructed facade, that shiny golden boy image our parents had polished for years now beginning to splinter under the weight of pressure he wasn't built to withstand. He was never meant to carry anything heavy, not guilt, not consequence, not even accountability. He was raised in a padded world, wrapped in soft lies and clean alibis, and now that those cushions were being stripped away one by one, he didn't know how to stand without them. I could see it in his posture the last time I saw him, shoulders slumped slightly, eyes darting toward every shadow, hands twitching at the edge of his coat sleeves like he was expecting someone to grab him at any moment. He stopped answering calls from my parents unless it was to bark out updates or demand they fix something, like this mess was just another inconvenience they could make disappear with a few carefully worded conversations and a lawyer on retainer. He'd been spoiled for so long he didn't understand that some problems weren't meant to be covered up, but burned down, root and stem. I watched him spiral from a distance, and I didn't lift a finger to stop it, not because I wanted to hurt him for the sake of revenge, but because I wanted him to finally feel the burden of the weight he'd spent his life throwing on my back. The final push came quietly, as most things do in stories like these. A short, typed letter. No signature. No return address. Just a plain manila envelope mailed to an address I'd been holding onto for years, waiting for the right moment to use. Nina, Evan's ex-girlfriend. The one he'd left bruised in more ways than one, both physically and emotionally, then buried the entire situation with our parents' help, like it had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. They'd paid her off, pressured her family, moved Evan out of town, reinvented the story so thoroughly that most people forgot it ever happened. But I didn't forget. I never do. And in that envelope was everything Nina would need to remember. Copies of texts, photos, fragments of the truth she'd tried to speak years ago but had been forced to swallow. I didn't add a note. I didn't need to. She'd know exactly where it came from and exactly what to do with it. A week later, her story hit the blogs first, one of those niche investigative sites that always seem to catch the stories the mainstream media ignored. The headline wasn't subtle. Whispers of abuse and money. Evan Carter's past comes to light. And from there, it spread like wildfire. Old classmates started chiming in, former coworkers hinting at rumors they'd heard, and suddenly Evan's past wasn't something our parents could bury anymore. It was a wildfire burning through every carefully curated narrative they'd built. Detective Delgado came knocking again, his demeanor noticeably different this time. He didn't ask if I wanted coffee. He didn't ease into the conversation. He went straight to the point, questioning why certain details in my original statement didn't line up with surveillance footage near the crash site, why timestamps didn't match, why tire tracks at the scene seemed inconsistent with my car's movement patterns. I kept my tone even, my expression calm, my answers just vague enough to keep the suspicion hovering without ever landing. And I could see it, the doubt flickering in his eyes, the subtle shift in how he looked at me. He knew something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it yet. I let him sit in that discomfort, let him feel what it was like to know the truth is just out of reach, but too slippery to catch. I'd spent my whole life in that space, so it seemed only fair to let someone else taste it for once. Meanwhile, my parents began to fracture in ways I'd never seen before. My mother snapped at my father in front of me, something she hadn't done in years. My father yelled at Evan on a phone call so loudly I heard every word through the wall, threats about ruining the family, about how Evan had gone too far this time. And in a twisted, poetic way, they were right, he had gone too far. But not in the way they thought. He went too far the day he crashed that car and thought he could hand me the consequences without hesitation. That was the moment he crossed the line. That was the moment I stopped forgiving. Still, for all the chaos I'd orchestrated, I never expected the message that arrived next. I was sitting alone in my living room, the television on but ignored, when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Just a single sentence, nothing more. You're not the only one playing a game. No name, no context, no clue as to who had sent it. But my pulse quickened, my fingers clenched slightly around the phone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Because I'd spent so long being the one behind the curtain, pulling strings, laying traps, crafting outcomes. But now it seemed someone else had decided to step onto the board. And I had no idea who they were, or what they wanted. It didn't take long for the whole thing to go from a slow-burning scandal to a full-blown collapse that even my parents couldn't ignore, couldn't manipulate, couldn't polish with polite conversation and backroom favors. Nina didn't just whisper into a corner of the internet. She went public with everything, standing tall in front of cameras, voice steady and eyes sharp as glass, naming names and detailing every piece of what Evan had done to her and how her family had worked tirelessly to bury it beneath money, reputation, and carefully spun lies. It was brutal. It was raw. It was honest in a way I had never seen anyone around us be before. And it was the final crack in a house that had been rotting from the inside for decades. The moment her story aired, the police officially reopened Evan's case, and suddenly our family name wasn't being mentioned in golf club newsletters or charity banquets. It was being spoken in precincts, in legal briefings, in the loud, breathless chatter of reporters hounding the driveway with cameras and questions. Detective Delgado came back, only this time he wasn't asking questions out of politeness. He came with a folder full of inconsistencies, digital trails, and contradictions that no amount of careful phrasing could explain away. He didn't accuse me outright. Not yet, but the edge in his voice was sharper now, colder, less patient. He'd connected enough dots to know I hadn't been entirely truthful, but not enough to prove where the real fault lines lay. Still, it didn't matter. Because by then, my plan was already moving faster than even I anticipated. The anonymous tips, the documents, the credit card trails, all of it was starting to converge, forming a picture that painted Evan as more than just a reckless kid who made one mistake. It painted him as a pattern of damage, a string of incidents wrapped in privilege, carelessness, and the relentless protection of two parents who had taught him that nothing was ever truly his fault. And now, finally, it was catching up to him in a way no one could stop. When the news broke that a warrant had been issued for Evan's arrest, my parents showed up on my doorstep again, looking like strangers in their own skin. My mother's mascara had smudged down the sides of her cheeks, and her hair was pulled into a hasty bun that betrayed just how much sleep she'd lost. My father's shirt was wrinkled, collar askew, and he looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of their choices was physically pushing his spine into a curve he couldn't straighten anymore. They didn't even try to hide their desperation this time. They came begging. They pleaded with me to fix it, to help them get ahead of this, to speak to Nina, to reach out to the press, to retract my earlier statement to the police and tell them I'd made a mistake. My mother's voice cracked when she said the words, and for the first time in my life, I saw her genuinely unraveling, not for Evan's sake, not because she suddenly realized what she'd helped cover up, but because her reputation was hanging by a thread. And the scissors were in my hand. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stared at them, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the weight of every year I'd been overlooked, every moment I'd been sacrificed, pressed down on the room like a storm cloud about to break. And then I laughed. I laughed right in their faces for the first time in my entire life. A sharp, bitter, guttural laugh that startled even me with its clarity. Because this pathetic little performance, this last-ditch attempt to put me back in their service, was the most predictable thing they'd ever done. You spent years teaching him there'd never be consequences, I said, my voice steady now, no longer pretending to soften for their comfort. Now he's facing them, and you're asking me to clean up a mess I didn't make. Again. My mother started crying, something I might have cared about once. My father turned away, probably ashamed, though I couldn't bring myself to believe it was for the right reasons. They had built this house, this gilded cage made of favoritism and denial, and now it was collapsing around them piece by piece. And for once, I wasn't the one trapped beneath it. Later that evening, I met Lena again, needing the clarity only she could offer, the bluntness only an old friend could afford. I told her everything, every move I'd made, every trap I'd set, every whisper I'd delivered into the right ears. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't cheer. Instead, she looked at me the same way she did the night I first told her what I planned to do, like she saw something in me that she wasn't sure she liked anymore. "You're not getting justice," she said quietly, not in judgment but in warning. "You're getting even." Don't pretend those are the same. And maybe she was right. Maybe I'd crossed a line somewhere along the way and didn't notice because I'd been walking in a straight line for so long. Maybe I'd become something else, someone colder, someone sharper. But the truth was, I didn't care. Because Evan was gone. He'd disappeared. No one knew where he went. Not his friends. Not his boss. Not even our parents. The warrant was active, the police were looking, and there was nothing left to protect him now. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one capable of playing games anymore. There's a stillness that settles over everything once the fire has finished its work, a quiet that hums like static in your ears, not peaceful, not triumphant, just empty, scorched, final. That was the kind of silence I found myself standing in as I watched the last remnants of my family's carefully curated image dissolve in public disgrace, their names dragged across headlines, their legacy crumbling under the weight of the very lies they thought would hold everything together. Diane and Charles Carter, once the model couple in their small suburban circle, the ones who hosted charity dinners and attended gallery openings, were now synonymous with cover-ups, corruption, and a son they could no longer protect. And Evan, the golden boy, the untouchable favorite, the pride of the family, his face was plastered across every news site, every social media post, his name suddenly synonymous with guilt, shame, and the echoing phrase, wanted for questioning. I didn't attend the auction where they sold the family home, though I heard through a neighbor that it went fast. Some investor bought it for less than it was worth, stripped it clean, and planned to flip it for profit. Fitting, I suppose. The house had never felt like a home to me anyway, more like a museum where affection was displayed under glass, and I was the forgotten exhibit collecting dust in the corner. I didn't care what happened to it. Let them tear up the rose bushes my mother obsessed over. Let them gut the kitchen my father used to brag about to guests. Let them wipe away every trace of the Carter name from those walls. I walked away from it all without looking back because I'd already burned it in my mind 100 times before. People kept asking if I felt relief, if I felt proud, if I felt vindicated, if I finally felt like I'd won something. And maybe for a while I tried to convince myself I did. But the truth is, I didn't feel any of those things. What I felt was something harder to name, something heavier than revenge and colder than justice. I didn't feel like I'd climbed out of the wreckage. I felt like I'd become the wreckage itself, like the damage I'd done in response to years of betrayal had reshaped me into something unrecognizable, even to myself. But still, I didn't regret it. Because everything they lost, they gave away freely the moment they asked me to take the fall again, without hesitation, without shame, without even pretending to offer anything in return. And that's the part people don't understand when they ask why I did it. It wasn't about the car. It wasn't even about Evan. It was about that moment in my doorway, their voices calm and practiced, already certain I'd bend to their will like I always had, like I hadn't changed at all. And here's the part no one knows, not even Lena, not even Nina, not even Delgado, who probably still walks around wondering where the last piece of the puzzle went. Evan didn't crash the car that night. I did. It was me behind the wheel, not drunk, not reckless, just tired, just distracted, just human. I lost control for a second and clipped that streetlight, panicked and drove off, heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode in my chest. And when I got home, I sat in the dark and waited for the guilt to come. But before it could, my phone rang and everything shifted. They called me before I said a word. Told me Evan had come home looking shaken, and they assumed, of course they assumed, that it was him who had crashed. They didn't even ask what had really happened. They just wanted me to take the blame. And in that moment, I realized something terrible and perfect. They would believe whatever story they needed to in order to protect him, even if it meant sacrificing me once again. And I let them. I smiled, said nothing, and let their assumptions carry them to the edge of the cliff while I stood behind them, watching quietly, holding the match. That was the trap. Not the planted evidence, not the tipped-off journalists, not even the reopened case. The real trap was in their belief that I was still the same girl who would bleed for their comfort without asking why. The real revenge was letting them build the gallows with their own hands, convinced they were saving themselves. They asked me to take the blame. I did. Just not for what they thought. A week after everything finally came to a head, after the press faded and the house was sold and my name was no longer part of their narrative, I sat in my small apartment with a glass of wine and the television off, trying to remember what silence used to sound like before it became a weapon. I opened my laptop to clear my inbox, and there it was, an email from a company I hadn't spoken to in years, one I'd sent a resume to out of curiosity months before any of this began. The subject line was simple: fresh start? And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel tired or bitter or broken. I just felt ready.